From Philharmonic Hall in Lincoln Center, home of the world's greatest musical events, another program in the award-winning series, the New York Philharmonic Young People's Concerts, under the musical direction of Leonard Bernstein.
And here is Mr. Bernstein.
I'm surprised to find you all in your seats. I'd half expected to turn around and see everybody doing the samba or something up and down the aisles. Because this American music is almost irresistible when it's good, like the batuque we just heard by the Brazilian composer Fernandes. It has a way of stirring up the blood, not only our North American blood, but people's blood all over the world. Ever since I can remember, there's always been an international craze of some kind for Latin American dance music. From the old Argentine tango, which swept the world during my childhood, all the way through the rumba, the samba, the conga, the mambo, the cha-cha, pachango, merengue, right up to the present excitement over something called the bossa nova. What is it that makes this music from South and Central America so exciting? Well, there are two ingredients that give this music its special Latin flavor: rhythm and color. Now, the first of these, rhythm, doesn't mean just the beat, that insistent, obsessive beat, but the complicated rhythms that go on over the beat. For instance, in this batuque we just played, you heard a fascinating beat that went. It's already pretty exciting, not only because it keeps repeating insistently, but because it has that syncopated accent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sure a lot of you remember what syncopation means from other programs of ours we've given. A syncopation is an accent that falls where it doesn't belong or where you don't expect it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You expect it on 1 and it falls on 4. That's exactly what happens in this batuque beat. But over that syncopated beat, there are rhythms that are even more syncopated and more complicated, like this one. So what with one syncopation and another, it turns into a pretty hectic boxing match with sudden lefts and rights hitting you where and when you least expect them. And that, plus the insistent repetition of the beat, explains why you want to get up and dance when you hear this kind of music. Now, the second element that we find so attractive in Latin American music is all that special instrumental color. It's unmistakable. You're never in doubt about what kind of music you're listening to the moment you hear, for instance, this colorful little sound. Now, that's a pair of maracas. And what's a rumba or a samba without a pair of maracas? The same is true of that well-known dry little sound you get from hitting two sticks together, what the Cubans call claves. And then there are all kinds of gourds like this. And rasping sticks. And an endless variety of other things like conga drums and bongos that make the music sound Latin. Now, actually, I'm not crazy about that word Latin to describe this kind of music because it tells only part of the story. When we speak of Latin America, we are, of course, referring to the historical fact that these countries were conquered, settled, and exploited by invaders from Latin countries like Spain, or as in the case of Brazil, from Portugal. And that's why Spanish and Portuguese are still the official languages of our friends to the south of us. And those languages are called Latin languages because they developed from the old language of ancient Rome. But the Latin American spirit, which is our subject today, has other ancestors besides the Latin ones, at least as important. And they are, first of all, the Indians, the original inhabitants of those countries, and in some cases very strong civilizations in themselves. And secondly, Africans, a tremendously important influence, at least as important as it is in our own country. And it's the mingling of these different ancestors, influences, and heritages which makes the Latin American spirit what it is, at any rate, in music. But we mustn't begin to think that all Latin American music is only chaka-chaka-chaka-chaka dance music, not by a long shot. Our Latin neighbors have produced a very impressive number of serious symphonic composers who have succeeded in preserving the folk flavor of their own countries, while at the same time expanding their music into what we think of as universal art. That is, music that has not only a nationalistic spirit, but the spirit of all mankind. Now, certainly the most admired of all these composers was the great Brazilian Villa-Lobos, who died only 3 years ago leaving many beautiful compositions. And we're now going to hear the most famous one, the Bachianas Brasileiras number 5. Now that's a mouthful of a title, but it's simple to understand. Bachianas simply means pieces like Bach, the great German composer Bach. In other words, Bachian pieces, Bachianas in Portuguese. And Brasileiras means Brazilian, naturally, and number 5 means that he wrote almost a dozen different works using this title, of which this is the 5th. So there you have it, Bachianas Brasileiras number 5. Now, what is Bach doing in Brazil? Well, that's just the point of this piece, and really the point of all the pieces Villalobos composed. He wanted to bring together his native folklore elements with the great European musical tradition and unify them into a single style of his own, as he does in the very title of this piece, Bachianas Brasileiras. And it's amazing how well he succeeded, as you will hear, especially in the first movement. There are 2 movements to this piece, which, by the way, is written for a soprano voice and an orchestra consisting of nothing but 8 cellos. Now, in the first movement, which is slow and tender, he has the soprano sing a long melodic line without words, just the syllable ah. And underneath, the 8 cellos accompany this Bachian song like one huge guitar. And then comes a short middle part that does have words in Portuguese about the moon, but then the singer goes back to the wordless Bachian melody, only this time, instead of singing ah, she hums it. Altogether, it makes a haunting and unforgettable atmosphere. Then comes the second movement, which is much more Brazilian than Bachian. It's a fast, gay tongue twister that does sound like a native folk dance. And now this difficult and fascinating work will be sung for us by the brilliant Israeli soprano, Netanya Davrat.
viola, cade il mio pin, cade Maria. Anche se sorte del violero cantando, ah, segna viola che cantava seu amor, seu assobio, tua flauta di rirì, e tua flauta do sertão canta assobio.
so far, so far our music has been all Brazilian, which seems natural since Brazil is the largest Latin American country. But I don't want to give you the impression that it's the main source of Latin American music. Every single Latin American country, without exception, has produced fine, serious composers, from Mexico to the tip of Chile. But perhaps Mexico and Cuba have been in the lead, possibly because of their closeness to our musical centers, or possibly because they have such great international cities of their own. Actually, our next piece of Latin music, strangely enough, comes from both countries, since it was written by a Mexican composer named Revueltas, but was based on a poem by a Cuban poet named Guillen. It's a poem in which he remembers Africa and African tribal rituals, a weird sort of chant about killing a deadly snake. But this strange and terrifying piece, which is called Sensemaya, combines all the influences we've spoken of, African and Indian and European. You see, it's the work of a sophisticated composer with a very advanced technique like Villalobos, but he's handling an idea of savage primitiveness, and all that savagery and violence is to be heard in the wild rhythms and shrieks and howls of the orchestra that you will hear, but they are all controlled by the knowing hand of a real artist. It's much more complicated, more syncopated, more difficult than either of the pieces we have heard so far. But Revueltas was a real artist who died tragically young at the age of 40. And to judge by this short but thrilling piece we're going to hear, he might have achieved true greatness if he had lived. Here is his African, Indian, Cuban, Mexican poem for orchestra, Sensemaya. For the second part of our program, we're going to turn the tables and salute Latin America by playing music written by North American composers under the influence of Latin America. As I said before, we up here have always been enchanted by those Latin colors and rhythms, which have crept into our music just as naturally as jazz did. And this is especially true of the music of our leading American composer, Aaron Copland. Copland's an old friend of ours by now, since, as you may remember, we had an entire program of his music 2 years ago to celebrate his 60th birthday, when, among other things, we played his famous El Salón Mexico, which was his musical souvenir of a Mexican visit. Now, this time, we're going to play a delightful short piece by Copland that isn't heard as often as it ought to be. This one is a souvenir of his Cuban visit, and it's called Danzón Cubano, which doesn't mean Cuban dance, but Cuban danzón, which is a little different. A danzón is a special kind of dance in two clearly separated parts. The first part is always very elegant, restrained, and crisp. It's wonderful to watch the Cubans do it in their dance halls, because whatever social background they may come from, they look like princes and princesses as they dance the danzón, very straight and aristocratic, making clean, tiny movements. Then suddenly the dancers make a little pause while they gently apply their handkerchiefs to their moist upper lip, very daintily, even the huskiest truck drivers, for all the world like 18th century courtiers. And then, without any signal, as if by magic, they begin to dance part two, which is usually a bit faster and more exciting. But right to the end, they never lose that royal bearing and control. And if we can ever go to Havana again, I hope you'll all get a chance to see a Cuban danzón in action. In the meantime, here is Aaron Copland's symphonic version of the Danzón Cubano. It's pretty hot stuff. Now, most of the music we've played so far has probably not been very familiar to you. So now we're going to play something that may be a little more familiar. Some of the dance music I wrote for West Side Story. A lot of my music does show Latin American influences, but the music of West Side Story is particularly Latin, which is only natural since the story of this show is in great part about Puerto Ricans. And we're going to play you 4 of the dances from that show in a special new symphonic orchestration. The first 2 of these dances are straight out-and-out Latin dance forms, a mambo and a cha-cha. But the interesting thing to me is to hear how Latin influenced the other dances are, which are not mambos or anything. For instance, in the jazz piece called Cool, there are hints of bongos and other Latin sounds, and this is a piece that even has a serious fugue in it. And even in the rumble, which is simply ballet music that tells part of the story, you'll hear rhythms that will probably make you think of Cuba and Mexico, which all goes to prove that the word America means much more than only the United States, that North America, South America, and Central America are, or ought to be, a solid united hemisphere. But let's not get into politics. Let's get into the Latin American spirit with the mambo from West Side Story.
From Philharmonic Hall at Lincoln Center, another of the New York Philharmonic Young People's Concerts, under the musical direction of Leonard Bernstein, was titled The Latin American Spirit, and presented works by Fernandez, Revueltas, Villalobos, Copland, and Bernstein. Earlier, during this 6th year of televised concerts in the Young People's Series, the program titled Young Performers featured 4 young pianists in concertos by Mozart and Liszt. The music of Wagner, Mozart, Hindemith, and Brahms was presented in the program What is a Melody? And The Sound of a Hall featured works by Berlioz, Copland, Vivaldi, Walton, and Tchaikovsky. The preceding program was pre-recorded at Philharmonic Hall in New York City and was produced and directed by Roger Englander.